I'd like to read verses 21 through 23. Proverbs chapter 30, verses 21 through 23. Under 3 things the earth trembles, under 4 it cannot bear up. A servant who becomes king, a fool who is full of food, an unloved woman who is married, and a maidservant who displaces her mistress. As you guys can very easily tell from looking at me, I am not an athlete. In fact, I would say that I have a body like a sack of potatoes, but I wouldn't want to insult the potatoes. But one of my favorite things to do, not so much now as in the past, but one of my very favorite things that I loved watching professional and college athletes do is in a baseball game when a pitcher throws a knuckleball. How many of you in here know what a knuckleball is? Handful of you. Most of you don't. That's okay. I'm going to tell you. When you normally throw a ball, whether it's a baseball, softball, whatever it is, when you throw it, there's a spin on the ball, and that spin helps to determine where the ball goes. It usually goes in a fairly straight line or in a curve if you're throwing a curve ball or whatever it is. But with a knuckleball, you hold the ball basically by the fingers like this, and when you throw it, there's very little spin on the ball. Sometimes they're even able to throw it so that there's no spin on the ball whatsoever. And because there's no spin on the ball, it's almost impossible to predict where the ball is going to travel, because the way that the baseball travels through the air, you don't know where the seams are or whatever scuffs are on the ball. It might cause the ball to break this way, break that way, up, whatever. It can be a very unpredictable pitch. They can break in just about any direction, which can be very detrimental to the health of a hitter, but it can also be very dangerous for a catcher as well, because the catcher doesn't know where the ball is going to be going. It can be hard for an umpire to call it also, because the umpire may think that the ball is going to be coming in outside for ball 1, and now all of a sudden it breaks in, and the umpire's got to be real quick and says, oh, that's a strike instead of a ball. I have heard that the vast majority of those who advance their careers into the major leagues who threw the knuckleball did so because it was the only pitch they knew how to throw. They couldn't get a fastball fast. They couldn't learn to get a curveball to go in the direction they wanted to go. So they learned to throw the knuckleball. And generally speaking, knuckleball pitchers tend to have very long careers. It's pretty unusual for a knuckleballer not to pitch until he's about 43, 44 years old. The reason I talk about the knuckleball is because initially when I was going to start this sermon, I was going to talk about the curveballs of life. But then I realized a curveball doesn't really describe how things can come on you unpredictably, because when you get right down to it, even a curveball has a set path and a set trajectory, which if you know where it's coming, you can hit it. I think it's better to talk about the knuckleballs of life, because you don't know what direction they're going to go. You don't know where they're going to go. And in the same way that you cannot predict where the knuckleball is going to go, you cannot predict how, where, and when the knuckleballs of life are going to be thrown at you. When they come at you, and notice the key word there is when they come at you, not if. When they come at you, they will throw your life off balance. But unlike a pitch in a baseball game, these things can shake your world and cause an earthquake in your life, which frankly you didn't expect and didn't want to have happen. King Agur writes about the earthquakes of life in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 21 through 23. He mentions in this passage that there are 4 things which should not happen. Those 4 things, of course, being a servant who becomes king, a fool who has plenty of food to eat, an unloved woman who has a husband, and a maidservant taking over the position of her mistress. Why should these things not happen? Well, servants don't have the know-how to become a king, do they? Now, I'm not talking about the ordinary man or woman who works his way up the proverbial ladder and learns his or her job in order to become a manager or a CEO or whatever. I'm not talking about that kind of person. I think what Agur is more talking about would be taking someone in this audience, plucking them out of the pew, and sitting them in the Pentagon as a major general of the United States Marine Corps. No one in here is qualified to do that. And that's one of the things that Agur says should not happen. Another thing that shouldn't happen is fools' schemes should fail them, and therefore they should starve. I mean, how many of you in here know the parable about the ant and the grasshopper? You know, the grasshopper danced his way through summertime and had a good old time and made fun of the ant because the ant continually worked and worked and worked in order to gather up his food. But guess what happened when the wintertime rolled around? The ant was prepared for wintertime, and the grasshopper starved to death. An unloved woman shouldn't have anybody love them for whatever reason. He doesn't go into specifics, but I'm sure all of us in here can think of men, women, and let's be fair, men too, who are unloved and unlovable. Those kinds of things shouldn't happen. And last of all, a maidservant should not replace her mistress and become the new wife of the master. You see, in short, there is a definite order, or at least I should say a way in which we think this world should operate. Things should go like a clock. You ever heard the saying about, things going like clockwork? Things should go that way. But that clock many times gets messed up, doesn't it? And I think every one of us in here, regardless of your age, can attest to many things in their life which shook their world. Why do these things happen? Well, looking at the four specific examples of that Agur raises up, perhaps you have fools in power and they decide to put a favored servant out of some regard for equality in a high position. A qualified person ends up getting ignored while an unqualified person gets the job because someone decides for whatever reason, and we may never know what the reason is, to put that fool in a position of being king or being manager or whatever. A fool may inherit a lot of money, or perhaps his schemes end up being successful and his plans succeed. Now remember, guys, the biblical definition of a fool is not what we would normally say that it is. We tend to think, when we hear the word fool, we think of someone who's stupid or lacking in intelligence. The biblical definition of a fool is a man or a woman who lacks moral convictions, who despises wisdom and honor. In Proverbs chapter 1, it says that the fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Bernie Madoff would be a terrific example of that, wouldn't he? He got away for a long time with being able to live on the high life with the Ponzi scheme that he had going on. But he's not the only one. There are plenty of other examples to which we can point. An unloved woman may somehow get someone to marry her, and we end up shaking our heads and wonder, what in the world is going on? What's the guy thinking? Or what's the gal thinking? I remember when I was a senior in high school, and I'm going to go ahead and use the names. I know this is being recorded, so I do this on the very off chance that one of these two might hear what I'm saying here, but I'm going to count on the fact that we're 25 years removed, and hopefully 25 years has done a lot to make people grow up. But when I was a senior in high school, there were two juniors. One of them's name was Heidi, and the other one was named Scott. Scott Josephitis was his full name. Now, Heidi was a terrific young lady, and she really had a lot of things going for her. But unlike most girls who had a lot of things going for her, she didn't what's the word I want to say? She didn't lord it over others. She was very ordinary. She would talk to anyone, was friendly to everybody. Really, your stereotypical ideal young girl. Scott, on the other hand, and I'm sure all of us in here know of guys like this, was a guy who was very, very, very sold on himself, if you know what I mean. Very sold on himself. It got to the point where my group of friends, whenever we would see someone who was acting the fool or acting really stuck up, we would say that that person's got a bad case of Josephitis. In that case, our world shook. Why? Because the way that we viewed the world in that specific example was upside down. The nice girl ended up going out with the complete jerk. It turned out that Leo DeRocher, former baseball manager, was mostly right when he said that nice guys finish last. That was a hard lesson to learn right there. The last example that Edgar makes here is that the master may displace or remove the mistress, raise up the maidservant, and marries her, and now she becomes the new mistress. Don't know how that would have happened, but nonetheless, for whatever reason, the husband moves one out and brings in another. And notice that she is now the mistress. In short, we live in a very sinful world, which is run by wicked men and wicked women. And when we see those things happen, our world shakes. It's not just those things that cause our world to shake. It can be personal examples of things that happen to us that make our world shake, and our world can't stand under it. We ask ourselves the question, why? It's a legitimate question to ask. And sometimes there's no answer to the question of why our world shakes. I've discovered in my life, and I can't speak for everybody in here, and I'm certainly not going to presume to do that, but I have discovered that in my life, living a life of faith and trust in God through his son, Jesus Christ, means that I'm going to have to go through my life with many questions not only unanswered, but in many of those cases, even unanswerable. We simply are not going to know, in many cases, why this or that happened. In some cases, we might know. Maybe you were the victim of a wicked decision. Maybe someone decided to throw a knuckleball at you for whatever reason that they had. Perhaps, and let's not discount this, perhaps the reason is because you made the wicked decision and now you're going through the consequences. Occasionally on my Facebook page, I get someone who posts something that says something along the lines of this. Everything that happens has a purpose. Sometimes that purpose is because you're an idiot and you did something dumb. I know in my case, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, amen. But we're not going to know in every case, are we? Sometimes an answer is elusive. Let me ask you a question, guys. Think about the number one question in your life. Whatever it is, the most important question in your life. And then consider this. If you went through life knowing that you would never get an answer to that question here under the sun, would that be enough for you to lose your trust and faith in the Lord? Again, I can't speak for everybody, but I've reached the point in my life where although things bother me big time, and the number one question that I have in my life has not necessarily gone answered, I also realize that I'm not God. I realize that I'm not going to know everything. And you know what? The good news is there's someone that does. There's someone who does. He may not have an obligation to tell me, but I can rest comfortably in the fact that I know that there is someone who holds the answer. I am certain that all of us, either firsthand or secondhand, have experienced major earthquakes And sometimes, unfortunately, those earthquakes can be enough to end up tossing God to the curb and saying, well, forget it. In fact, I am also convinced, and I think I may have said this a handful of times in the past, I'm reasonably convinced that either the number one or the number two reason why we have men and women who deny God's existence is not because of the so-called intellectual arguments, but it's because life threw a curveball at them. Because of a bad experience, which shook their world. Consider Job. If you ever get the opportunity to do so, read the book of Job. Very deep, very insightful book. Because Job was a man who wrestled with the same issues that we do. You know, if the world worked like conventional wisdom says that it should work, Job would have lived a very peaceful, very prosperous life. Because the Bible describes Job as being an honorable and godly man who was very careful to do everything right in the eyes of God. Even so far as to offer sacrifice on behalf of his kids, because he thought to himself, well, maybe my kids have sinned and they need atonement for that. That's how careful he was. And yet, when you read Job, what do you discover? You discover a man who ended up losing everything except for his life and his wife. And I'll be honest with you, it's a wonder that his wife stayed with him. It really is. And look at the way that Job's life was shaken. He lost all of his possessions, his goods. He lost his reputation. People used to look up to him as a great and wise elder in the community in which he lived. Now he was laughed at, even by little children. Speaking of children, he lost his children, all 10 of them. And he lost his health. You know, if Agur would have seen the circumstances through which Job was going, maybe he could have written this proverb along this line. That there are 4 things which the world trembles under: a godly ruler who becomes a slave, a wise man who starves and is sick, a loved and respected man who is now scorned, and a master who ends up becoming completely nothing. All of those things applied to Job, didn't they? And throughout the book of Job, he continually asks God for answers. Why is this happening? What's going on here? I mean, why in the world did I lose everything? I didn't do anything wrong. Come on, God, give me an answer. Come before me and tell me what's happening. And by the way, his 3 friends didn't prove to really be much help, because his 3 friends tried to counsel him based on conventional wisdom. They tried to make the argument that, well, you're suffering and you're doing great, you're doing just terrible, because obviously you must have sinned. You must have done something wrong, Job, and you need to figure out what it is that you did wrong, and you need to repent of it. No, he didn't. He didn't. The 3 men, the 3 friends of Job, they couldn't wrap their mind around the fact that sometimes life shakes in a way that you don't expect it to shake. And yet when you continue to read the book of Job, when you get into, starting around chapter 38, I think it is, when God comes before Job and speaks to him, God didn't give Job an answer to what was happening, did he? You know, why is that? Why didn't God tell Job why these things happened to him? You know, there have been, I came to a realization about something. It was actually yesterday that I thought about this, that many times when we read the Bible, maybe we need to look at the answers in a more practical method, in a more practical sense than we sometimes do. I'll get back to Job in just a second here, but let me give you an example of this. When you look in the book of Acts, when the apostles select 7 men to take care of the orphans and widows of the church so they could continue the ministry of the word, there have been commentators who came up with all kinds of reasons. Well, why did the apostles pick 7? Well, because 7 is God's number and 7 represents completeness and so on and so on. Has it ever occurred to us that maybe the reason why the apostles picked 7 men was because 6 wouldn't have been enough and 8 would have been too many? Well, I mean, why don't we look at Scripture a little more from a practical standpoint than we do? And perhaps one of the reasons why God didn't answer Job's question is because Job would not have liked the answer. I mean, imagine one of us. Imagine you're Job and you're told by God that what's happening to you was to prove the evil one wrong. I have discovered that, generally speaking, a man who demands explanations is usually not satisfied with those explanations. God didn't give an explanation. Instead, he confronted Job and said, listen, you don't know who you're talking to. You know, where were you when the world was made? Can you lasso the behemoth? Were you the ones who bound the Pleiades, the star constellation? I'm probably badly mispronouncing it. Were you the ones who threw the stars in the sky and the angels sang for joy? You know, when Job was confronted with the awesomeness of God, his questions pretty much evaporated. But notice something about Job. He never lost his faith in God, did he? Did he come close? I think you could make the argument that he did come close, but he never lost his faith in the Lord. Even though his number one question was never answered, he never lost his faith in God, did he? How many of us can think of things which have shaken our world? Someone once said that there are 2 events in a person's life which will shake in their world harder than anything else. Number 1 is the death of a loved one, and number 2 is a divorce. But there are so many other things that can happen besides that can shake our world. Sickness. I can't imagine how Brother Tom felt when he heard the news from the doctor that he had cancer. I'll tell you right now, I'll bet you any amount of money that if I ask him this question, did that shake your world, Brother Tom? He'll nod his head and say, oh yeah, it did. A car accident, the loss of a job. These things can come together to throw knuckleballs at us, and we end up just flailing away at them and completely missing. These things bother us because, as I said before, guys, all of us have an idea about how life should go. Do we not think at a very foundational level that the righteous should always prosper and the wicked should always starve and suffer? Do we not think that when we do the right thing, when we obey the Lord, that good things are always going to happen, are always going to come? Whereas when you do evil, wrong things, bad things are going to happen. Do we not think to ourselves that when we work hard and don't procrastinate, our plans will lead to success? You know, if we lived in the kind of world which God originally intended, that would be the case. Or even if it was more ideal than what we have now, then it would be the case. And yet they don't always happen that way, do they? They don't always happen. It's so often that the man who has the best lawyer and the most money who gets the justice, while the little guy gets left in the lurch. The man who does the will of God ends up being persecuted, insulted, reviled, or worse, while the man who spits in God's face is the one who lives long and prospers. And our world shakes when that happens. How many of you guys in here have ever seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Handful of you have? You know, if I was going to make a top 10 list of my favorite movies, that movie would be on my list. I love that movie so much. It's a great film. I thought Spielberg and Lucas did a great job of portraying the Holy Grail and so on. I'm not going to go into that. But you know, there's one, for those of you who haven't watched the movie, I apologize. I'm probably going to be telling you some details which you don't know about. But for those of you who have seen the movie, there's one character in that movie that I feel bad for more than anybody else. I know it's only a movie, and okay, fine. But there's one character in that movie that, you know, when I watch that movie, I feel a twinge of sorrow for. And that's the knight at the end of the movie that was charged with guarding the Holy Grail. For 700 years, he was in the cavern, guarding the Grail, watching over it. He did what he was called to do. He executed his job faithfully until someone else would come along and replace him. And yet, look what happened. You see, for those of you who haven't seen the movie, let me just give you a very quick synopsis. When Indiana Jones finds the Holy Grail, the knight tells him, you picked the right one, but you cannot take the Grail past the Great Seal at the front of at the entrance of the temple. You can't take it past there. It has to stay here. Well, the problem is that one of the bad guys saw the Grail and tried to take it out. And as a result, the entire temple just started falling in on itself. It started collapsing in on itself. As Indy and his father were trying to rescue each other and trying to get themselves out of the temple to avoid being crushed to death by the falling stones, Indy's father happens to look back for a moment and sees the knight standing there with just such a solemn and sorrowful look on his face. You know, here's a guy that did everything right, and yet look what happened to him. Because of the folly and the wickedness of man, he ended up having his world shaken and turned upside down. These things can cause us to do what Job did and ask the Lord, what in the world is going on? Did you guys know that the psalmists ask the exact same question in so many of the Psalms? In fact, I think we hit over one in our lesson in the Adult Quarterly, Psalm 94, where the psalmist says, what's going on, God? Why is this happening? Look at the lives of Jesus Christ as well as his apostles and his followers through the ages. I mean, obviously, guys, the greatest example of a world being shaken would be that of Jesus himself. You know, if conventional wisdom would have held true with Jesus Christ, he would have lived life to be an old man and died prosperous. Because he was a guy who did everything right. And yet look what happened to him. Look what happened to Paul. I had Brother Foster read that passage in 2 Corinthians 11. Look at the things that happened to Paul. He was beaten 5 times, on 5 different occasions with 39 lashes, spent the day and the night in the open sea, was almost killed, by stoning. I was going to say that he was almost stoned, but that wouldn't sound good. But he was almost put to death by having rocks thrown at him. You tell me those things didn't shake his world? Paul was, and it was all because he was following the Lord. The rest of the apostles, some of them were exiled. Some of them were put to death by the sword. Some were impaled. Some were burned alive throughout history. Those who have been true believers and followers of God through his Son, Jesus Christ, have had their worlds shaken. Because if conventional wisdom held true, they shouldn't have gone through what they were going through. And yet, did not Jesus warn us that our lives were not going to be all neat and tidy? Excuse me. Didn't he warn us that things were not always going to go in the manner in which we think that they're going to go? Should go? Correct me? Now, granted, we may not have gone through the things that the Lord has gone through and his apostles and our brothers and sisters throughout the world today. But that doesn't mean that our world in some form or another hasn't been shaken. And if it hasn't, I promise you it will. I guarantee it. All of us have had experiences under which our world could not stand. All of us, as Agur said in Proverbs 30, there are things which the earth cannot endure or tolerate. And you know, when those things happen, many times, if not most of the time, we don't have the power to stop them. In talking about the knuckleball, former Major League catcher Bob Uecker once said that the best way to handle a knuckleball was simply to wait until it stopped rolling and then bend down and pick it up. Sometimes, the only way we're going to handle the knuckleballs of life is to wait and go through them and until they go past you. That is what many of those who have gone before us had to do. And I guarantee you we'll have to do the same thing. Paul himself said in Acts 14 that we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. But here's the good news. I spent a lot of time talking about the bad news. But here's the good news. And I know some of you out here are looking for some good news. I'm not going to say, okay, sermon over, have a nice day. If I did that, I don't think I'd be back again. Here's the good news. We have been warned that life would not always go the way that we think it should go, but we also have the guarantee of Jesus himself that this world is not always going to shake. There is going to come one more time when the world is going to shake, but it's going to be God himself that's going to do it. He's going to be the one who makes this world shake, and he is going to be the one who, when the world shakes, is going to make everything right. He's the one who's going to set us on a firm foundation so that we will never have to worry about the frustrations and the hardships of life. I heard a pastor one time say that under the sun, and this is going to be slightly doctrinally incorrect, so please forgive me, but under the sun, this is the closest to hell that a believer in Jesus Christ will ever experience. It's the closest thing you'll ever have to worry about. You know, I'm firmly convinced that a big reason why our world sometimes shake is because we need reminders. We need reminders, my friends, that this world is not the best world. There is a new, as the hymn says, there is a new world coming. God has the restoration of the world in mind. And I can tell you that has been a terrific revelation for me. No, you know, I have a couple of issues in my life, which I'm not going to go into right now, but they shake my world. And they make me at times wonder, God, what in the world is going on? Why is this happening? But you know what? I think that they're there in order to remind me that there's a better world coming. There's a better world coming. I think we need to hold to that. Could this be the reason why some of you are going through the things which you are going through? Is to remind you that this world is not all that there is. And guess what? He's got something better for you. He has got something better for us. You know, there's an old Irish proverb which goes like this. Being Irish means laughing at life, knowing full well that life will crush you in the end. Those of you who know me well enough know that I do tend to be pessimistic about life, and I know the meaning of that proverb very well. And I'll tell you guys, if this world was all that there was, if Dawkins and the rest of them are right, and this world is all that there is, I say that's a proverb we need to adopt. Let's laugh at life because one day it's going to crush us. But guess what? Because of Jesus, I can turn that proverb around on its head. And I can laugh at the frustrations of life. I can laugh at life, knowing that God will one day make it all right in the end. Amen? Amen. I can look at the earthquakes in my life, and I can say, you know what? They're hard now. Don't like it. Don't like what I'm going through right now. Can't stand it. But you know what? One day God's going to make it good. Life is not going to crush me. And life does not have to crush you either. No matter what it is through which you may be going, life doesn't have to smash you up and chew you up and spit you out. Because Jesus Christ lives. About 3-4 weeks ago, I received a text from a good friend of mine in Wisconsin who told me about a mutual friend of ours who had passed away. He was a regular at our church. His name was Larry Bredesen. He wasn't in the best of health, so on a certain level, his death didn't come really as a surprise to me. But I will say this, that I was very saddened about his loss. He and I were pretty good friends. He was a Packer fan. I was a Bears fan. That should tell you something right there, how much we were able to tolerate each other. And I have to admit, I had to stop working for a couple of minutes. And I thought about him and his family. His life was a great example of the way that God can change lives. He went from being your stereotypical grumpy old man. How many of you here have seen the movie Grumpy Old Men? He would have been Walter Matthau's character, Max Goldman. Get off my lawn. But he went from being that, thanks to the power of the Spirit of God, to being just a man who loved God. His love for his family was renewed, and he became a very powerful prayer warrior in our church. I remember the last few years I lived in Beloit, Wisconsin before I moved here. He made it a point to come to the church at 9:30 every morning, go to one of the back rooms and pray for our service. I sometimes tried to join him. I sometimes didn't. Just a great testimony to how God can change lives was his. Though, when I heard about his passing, when I heard about his death, something else popped into my mind, and I already said this just a moment ago. Because Jesus lives, ultimately, I can laugh at the frustrations of life. Because ultimately, I know that I will see him again. I know I'll see him again. That's why. That's why. I have one last thing that I want to read for you, and then we'll close with our last hymn. If you want to read the passage to which Matthew Henry is referring, you can turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. And as you're reading that, you can listen to these comments that he makes. It's a little long. I promise to be quick, and we'll wrap up. But in his commentary on 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, Matthew Henry writes these words. Christ had told them that in the world they should have tribulation, and so they had. Yet they met with wonderful support, great relief, and many allays to their sorrows. We are, says the apostle, troubled on every side, afflicted many ways, and we meet with all sorts of troubles, yet not distressed. We are not hedged in or cooped up, because we see help in God and help from God, and have liberty of access to God. Again, we are perplexed, often uncertain and in doubt what will become of us, and not always without anxiety, in our minds on this account, yet not in despair. Even in our greatest perplexities, our greatest puzzlements, knowing that God is able to support us and deliver us, and in him we always place our trust and hope. Again, we are persecuted by men, pursued with hatred and violence from place to place, as men not worthy to live, yet not forsaken of God. Good men may be sometimes forsaken of their friends, as well as persecuted by their enemies, but God will never leave them nor forsake them. Again, we are sometimes dejected or cast down. The enemy may, in a great measure, prevail, and our spirits begin to fail us. There may be fears within as well as fightings without, yet we are not destroyed. Still, they were preserved and kept their heads above water. They kept their heads above water because they knew that he lives. I ask all of us in here to remember that as well. Whatever it is you're going through right now, whatever it is, little or big, you can keep your head above water and even well above water because he lives. And let's close with that particular hymn.